All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Dave, me, and Nick will be doing our preview and prediction for the Pac-12 championship game, a rematch between Utah and USC. The spread currently has the Trojans favored by 3 with an over-under set at 67, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on ESPN. Allegiant Stadium in Las Vegas, Nevada will be the site of this one. USC leads the all-time series 13-8 with Utah winning the regular season meeting on a 2-point conversion with less than a minute to go. Looking at this USC offense, Nick, it's been complete dynamite this season, 42.5 points per game. Caleb Williams is currently a minus 2,500 favorite for the Heisman Trophy, putting together a marvelous season. 66% completion rate, 34 touchdowns, 3 picks, 351 yards, rushing, and 10 touchdowns. And the biggest part of Caleb Williams' game is his ability to just be an escape artist. He's incredibly hard to bring down in the pocket. Has certainly avoided, double-digit type number of sacks this year at least. And you look at what he's done in the last 2 weeks, carried him to a win against UCLA after a slow start, was, dynamic against Notre Dame, ran for 3 touchdowns. And then that leads you to the Utah game in the first meeting this year, completed under 60%, but he had 381 and 5 touchdowns. This offense, 570-plus yards of offense against the Utes. They really had Utah stretched vertically. They really had them stressed out a good bit in this offense, top to bottom. They've been incredibly dynamic. Travis Dye went down, but Austin Jones has had no problem stepping up. 609 yards and 5 touchdowns rushing on the year. 274 of those yards and 2 of those scores coming over the past 2 games. He runs with plenty of physicality. Austin Jones has had no problem filling in for Dye here. What do you make of this USC offense? Dye obviously being out is big, but they've not been effective one bit in the running game. And then, of course, you have an incredibly deep receiving core. Jordan Addison's back to full health, it seems. Taj Washington's a great deep threat for him. Mario Williams as well is incredibly healthy. Caleb Williams, he was without those guys, Williams and Addison, a couple of games ago, and he still managed to put up 400-plus yards and a numerous amount of touchdowns. Nick, what are your thoughts generally on this offense top to bottom?
The Heisman Trophy certainly belongs to Caleb Williams. He's having an incredible season. We wondered if he'd be able to kind of show off and put together this type of season on the West Coast. We hoped he would have that explosive offense under Lincoln Riley, considering the weapons they picked up in the portal. And he certainly has not disappointed. 3,712 yards, 65.8% completion percentage, 34 touchdowns, 3 interceptions against Notre Dame last week. I mean, he looked like a wizard. He was escaping plays, creating plays for himself. He scored a rushing touchdown at one point that looked like it was a completely dead play. It looked like it was going to be a sack for a significant loss. Then all of a sudden, he wheezes his way through and gets into the end zone, right? So this guy is an absolute wizard at quarterback. He's really living up to the hype that he had coming out of high school and has really showed that USC made the right move picking him out of the portal. And, they lost Travis Dye. You thought they might lose a little bit of speed there. Haven't skipped a beat. Austin Jones has kind of stepped in. He was a great backup back. We highlighted that in the preseason. We thought he might have a good season in that number 2 role. Now he's getting the bulk of the carries, and he's really showing that he has the ability to be that number 1 featured back. 609 yards on the season, 98 attempts, 6.2 yards per carry, plus the 5 scores. Incredible numbers for the guy who's really stepping up here. I look at Raleek Brown as well. He's a solid backup now, kind of playing that number 2 role. He's 166 yards on the year, 4.6 yards per carry, plus 2 scores. This wide receiving core, any way you slice it, talent everywhere. We knew Jordan Addison would be great, right? Comes from Pittsburgh, is having a fantastic season despite injury troubles. 810 yards plus the 8 scores for him, 15 yards per catch. Taj Washington, Mario Williams, Brennan Rice. These guys are all great supporting cast members. He has 400 yards on the season and 2 scores for him, 13.2 yards per catch. Another guy like Michael Jackson III, he isn't getting a whole lot of touches either, but he's a talented wide receiver. He's got 205 yards, 15.8 yards per catch, and the 3 scores for him. Anyway, you slice this offense has so many different weapons. Hard to keep this offense contained. They're putting up a ton of points for a reason. 42.5 points per game, 500 total yards of offense per game. This offense is fantastic, and I don't expect them to slow down anytime soon.
Michael Jackson, a speed guy, like to get involved on the edge. Kyle Ford, a bigger body. 6'3", 220, and Jordan Addison, incredibly thin frame. Only 4 games, 100-plus yards this year for him. Relatively quiet compared to a season ago, but he's still, again, he's been a little beaten up, but he's still a dynamic right runner who can make plays from the slot, and he can make plays out wide as well. USC, I think a big reason for their success is the offensive line, though. Brett Nylon, Justin Dietrich, Andrew Voorhees, those guys on the interior, some big bodies and some big movers. Those guys, especially Dietrich and Nylon, they've been, pretty elite. Nylon is one of the more underrated centers in all of college football, pass blocking, run blocking. He's been exceptional. And, Caleb Williams, of course, he's kind of let those, sack numbers go down a little bit with his ability to escape. But top to bottom, the offensive line's been great. And, they're facing a Utah team that likes to pride themselves on physicality, but it's not been the story this year for their defense. What do you expect from this offensive line in a game that, if they win, they're going to the playoffs?
Right, they gotta be physical. They gotta be able to, protect the quarterback, block this defensive line coming in from Utah. It's a solid front seven that Utah has. They didn't have a big physical showing. They kind of lacked that at times in the game against Utah previously, where they lost. Letting the linebacking core for the Utah, which has not been too impressive this year, get after the quarterback and make Caleb Williams uncomfortable. He certainly can handle the pressure, but if you want to protect your quarterback, they got to, block big on the front line for sure this weekend. I want to see these offensive linemen get a couple good blocks. Stand strong and do not let anything easy give it up.
Now, looking at a Utah offense that's the definition of balance, 39.4 points per game. They can catch you from multiple different ways. Biggest problem for them is they're really beat up, Nick. This is not a very deep offense in terms of depth or production, and that's something we highlighted coming into the season. Tavion Thomas, he's now out for the year. His career is over. He'll be heading to the NFL. Dalton Kincaid injured against Colorado. Kyle Whittingham pretty mum on his status for this game. He's expected to play here in this game in his hometown of Las Vegas, but him being beat up is big because they're not very deep one bit at pass catcher. This is a guy that absolutely scorched the Trojans in the first meeting. 16 grabs, 234 yards, absolutely insane game there. 16 receptions the last two games for over 200 yards. I mean, he's been their entire offense when it comes to pass catching. They don't exactly have that vertical speed. Devon Vili is probably their best pass catcher at wide receiver, 6'5", 205. 50 grabs, 595 yards. He's a guy that, picks up first downs, averages about 50 yards per game. But, they don't have vertical speed. Same with Money Parks, 21 receptions. After that, it's Micah Bernard, who's going to get the go at running back now. And then Jalen Dixon has 21 receptions. This is not a very deep team, Nick, especially with Brant Kuzi being injured, all the way back in September. Depth is really starting to become a problem here. Cam Rising, 391 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground. Again, Bernard, this is a guy who is a versatile running back. He can catch the ball. He can run the ball. They even had him playing corner last year in the Rose Bowl. That's how athletic he is. Cam Rising, though, a guy that, was big in this game a season ago, and he was great for Utah. This year, he's been kind of struggling. He was big in that game against USC in the first meeting where he had 415 yards and 2 touchdowns. But the last month or so, he's really been struggling. Under 235 yards in 4 games. Did complete 89% against the bad Colorado team. He was awful against Oregon on the road. 170 yards, 55% completion rating with 3 interceptions. 3 of his 7 picks came in that game alone. So Rising, a veteran who also made a big mistake against Florida. It seems like his decision-making, Nick, hasn't exactly progressed the way you would imagine as you come down to the bottom of the season here. Of course, they ended up getting into the Pac-12 title game anyways, but they did lose that game to Oregon where they could have controlled their own destiny, mainly because his play was so poor.
Right. This offense has not lived up to the hope that we had. We had some concerns about the depth of this offense preseason. We expected Cam Rising to take that step forward, but he really hasn't. He hasn't looked as good as he should this year. 22 touchdowns, 7 interceptions from 66.4% completion percentage, 2,600 yards. On the ground, you expected more to Rising, below 400 yards, 6 scores for him. And now with Tavion Thomas out, that really takes away a whole factor for this offense, and it's definitely shown since Thomas has been out. Micah Bernard's a good back. I like Bernard a lot, but, he's carrying the load here, and it's certainly a stressful role for him. You can see that's kind of taking its toll. He hasn't really had the potential to live up to that expectation that we've had so far. He has only nearly 400 yards in the season and 3 touchdowns for him. They lack the talent at pass catcher. If Kincaid's not playing, that's certainly going to be an issue. Vile, he's their leading pass catcher in terms of wide receivers, but he's not having that great of a season either. Below 600 yards, only 5 scores, 11.9 yards per catch. This offense is just not that talented. We worried about the depth early on in the season, and the injuries have caught up to them, and the offense is struggling.
Looking at the rushing attack, though, for Utah, they did have 383 against Colorado, struggled a good bit against Oregon. It was hard to find rushing lanes in that one. They only had 138 in the first meeting against USC. Did have 4 touchdowns. I'm pretty sure all of them were goal line touchdowns. This is an offensive line that's only allowed 8 sacks this year. Tona Toagi at guard, he's been great. Braden Daniels at tackle. This is an offensive line. Keaton Bills as well, a veteran at guard. Top to bottom, I think the offensive line is pretty solid, respectable unit. They do pave the way for 220 rushing yards per game. And USC had 0 sacks in the first meeting. And, the pass protection was just exceptional in that meeting. So, what are your expectations for this offensive line going against the USC defensive line that certainly started to improve here in the back half of the year?
This USC defensive line is certainly getting better as time goes. The offensive line for Utah has certainly impressed me, but I think with the talent they have coming off the edge for USC, I think there's potential here to kind of make Cam Rising uncomfortable, force him out of the pocket, and force him to make plays that he's not really ready to make. If this Utah offensive line struggles on Saturday, they're certainly going to be in trouble, as USC will have a field day against them on defense and be able to put a ton of points on the board.
Looking at that USC defense, it's certainly gotten a lot of criticism this year. 405 yards per game allowed, 6.1 yards per play. It's been the bend but don't break type of style this year. I'd say they looked really good in the trenches against Notre Dame. Not so great against UCLA. They did allow 7.8 yards per play against the Irish, 6.8 against UCLA. And in that first Utah meeting, 562 yards, which is a season high, 7.3 yards per play. This is a defense, Nick. They give up a lot of yards. I do think over the last couple of games, they've certainly been a little bit better against the run, especially against the Irish, a big physical offensive line. And it all starts up front with Tui Pilotu. This guy is having an absurd season. First team All-American nationwide, 40 tackles. Half of those have been tackle for losses. 20 TFL on the year, 12.5 sacks. He's the leader in the middle. And he's a complete game wrecker, and that's going to be a guy that's going to have to lead this unit up front. Tyrone Talani, I think he's really been stepping up the last couple of weeks. Top to bottom, this is a pretty solid defense in terms of talent because I think they have some great individual players like Tui Pilotu. Mekhi Blackman's having an exceptional year out at corner. Shane Lee, 69 tackles. He's been big for them. Kalen Bullock, he's a heck of a ball hawk for them with 5 interceptions. 19 picks on the year for this USC defense. They've forced 26 turnovers, and a lot of people were picking USC to lose to UCLA a couple weeks ago, saying that the turnovers have been drying up, and they certainly had. Numerous games in a row, they weren't really forcing that many turnovers. 3 picks in that game, forced a fumble, including a game-winning interception by Corey Foreman off a great call from Alex Grinch to drop him in the coverage. This defense, Nick, they give up a lot of yards, they give up a lot of points, but playmaking seems to be evident, and it was like that in the Notre Dame game as well. They stepped up in the red zone at times. I believe they came up with a 4th down stop also. So this defense, they've certainly seemed to be playing with a different chip on their shoulder, but we cannot ignore the elephant in the room, and that is the defense still gives up a lot of production.
There certainly is a lot of talent on this defense, but it is hard to look past the yards they give up. 400 yards allowed per game is a ridiculous number. This defense does get a lot of takeaways, which is certainly impressive. The interception ratio and the turnover ratio with the team is fantastic. Tui Pilotu, who's having an incredible season, 20 tackles for loss, half his tackles are tackles for loss, is a ridiculous number. 12.5 sacks. He gets after the quarterback. That's the key on Saturday. Can he get after Cam Rising, make him uncomfortable? I think it's certainly possible. Shane Lee's also got 2.5 sacks. Nick Figueroa's got 4.5 as well. So this team can certainly get after the quarterback when they need to. Salmon Bird as well on the defensive line. He's got 4 sacks. Tulane has 5 as well. This team certainly can get after the quarterback. I like the production there. Shane Lee leading the way for the linebackers and the team in total, 69 total tackles. Eric Gentry's got 61 tackles. He's been fighting injuries all season, but he's a solid linebacker top to bottom. This defense can cause takeaways, but they also give a ton of points, which has certainly been a problem for them.
The 2 games this year, USC failed to record a sack and was against Oregon State and Utah, 2 one-possession games. So, generating pass rush here in these big-time games, they've only had 3 the last 2 weeks against 2 ranked opponents. That's certainly one thing they need to do, and I think they might be looking to take some more risks here now that they don't have to defend the middle of the field as heavy as Kincaid. Of course, he is questionable, pretty hobbled coming into this game. At least that's the expectation. So if they don't have to focus on him, I think that's going to allow them to, mix things up a bit. They don't send many blitzes with their defensive backs. Their linebackers don't come off very often. It's really the defensive line they lean on the most, which is not great when you have a front 4 coming after the quarterback, and that's it. And then you leave everybody else in coverage. You're still getting torn apart on the ground and through the air. That's not great. And I do think Utah, with their physicality and having a veteran at quarterback and Cam Rising, that's certainly going to be a problem. I'm not really too worried about the vertical threat speed from Utah. And again, if Kincaid is hobbled, then I'm not too worried about that either. It's kind of a mystery game to see what's going to happen here for USC on defense, because they've certainly, at least it feels like they're improving the last 2 weeks. But when you look at the stat sheet, that's not the full story. What's the expectation in this game? Because Utah, they're down Tavion Thomas. We keep talking about the star tight end. We're not sure of his status. And Cam Rising, of course, playing, not his best football here at the end of the season. What's the expectation in this game for USC?
If they can get after the quarterback, they're having a great day, right? If they can put the pressure, the stat you said, the 2 games that they were 1-possession games, Utah, Oregon State, they had 0 sacks. They got to get after Cam Rising and put pressure on him. If they're able to sack Rising early on, make him uncomfortable, they're going to pull away with this one easily. I think that the fact that Kincaid may not be full healthy and certainly losing Tavion Thomas, kind of makes Utah's offense a little one-dimensional. It's going to be a run-heavy offense on Saturday, running through running through Micah Bernard and Cam Rising. So if they can contain those 2, kind of force Utah to throw, they'll be able to get a couple picks in here and get positive turnovers, get positive yardage, and control the damage on defense.
Looking at Utah defense, they're only giving up 20.1 points per game and 317.5 yards per game. That's not the full story, though, Nick. Looking at their biggest games of the year this season, they've really struggled. You look all the way back to week 1 against Florida, gave up 450-plus yards, got bullied on the ground by that attack. UCLA, 500-plus yards, averaged over 8 yards per play. And then the next week against USC, of course, they gave up 556, which was a season high. And they've played really good the last couple of weeks. Washington State a few weeks ago only got 264 yards. That's an impressive, talented offense. They played against Oregon, only 346 in that one against the hobbled Bo Nix, where they were able to really stop the run. I think that matchup that week really favored them there in Eugene. The defense has really struggled vertically. They've been very stressed in the trenches against the run. Utah's defense nowhere near what you think it would be. And if you're just a casual looking at the stat sheet, you would imagine and you would think this is an elite defense. I think it's far from it. Junior Tafuna, Van Fillinger, these guys have not exactly been dynamic up front for Utah. And Fillinger has not played in weeks. I don't believe he's going to play in this game. Can't really find much of an injury report. You look at Gabe Reed, though, who's been terrific coming over from Stanford as a pass rusher. Big fan of his. Cole Bishop, this is a guy that really emerged at the back half of last year. He's emerged as a star for this defense, 68 tackles, 6 tackles for loss. He's a great pass rusher. He's great at getting up in the box and slowing down the run. Speaking of injuries, though, for this football team, Clark Phillips, he's also questionable. He's a little bit beat up coming into this game. Whittingham still not very clear on what he expects out of Phillips for Friday night's game, so we're not sure if he's going to play. This guy, he's been one of the top cover corners in college football for Utah, and this is a passing attack USC that already tore up this defense one time. RJ Hubert really struggled in that game. Jatavis Brown on the other side, he's a veteran cornerback, so I certainly think the personnel is there, top to bottom on this defense. And they're very deep on the defensive line as well. Jonah Ellis, Connor O'Toole, and the aforementioned Reed. This is a good defense in terms of individual talent, Nick, but they've not been great in terms of physicality. They've been very stressed in the secondary, which I knew depth would be a problem for them coming into the season in the back end. It's just not been the year you imagine from a Utah defense. It's probably going to struggle in this one, as they have all year long against these type of offenses.
The stats look good for Utah's defense, but just really hasn't shown that in the actual games. If Clark Phillips doesn't play on Saturday, that's a huge loss. He has 6 picks on the year, 23 total tackles for him, plus a sack. He's a solid cornerback, one of the best in the nation, leads the way for the defense. If he's missing, that's a serious problem for them. I like guys like Cole Bishop. I like Mohamed Diabate. I like these kind of guys. Bishop especially, 68 total tackles on the year for him, plus the interception, 1.5 sacks for him. Reed, O'Toole, these guys are not bad on the defensitive line. Barton as well, solid guy, 3.5 sacks for him at linebacker, 36 total tackles on the year. But this defense has a tendency to get beat when it matters most. They're getting beat over the top again. Well, they kind of just struggle and fall into a bad pattern where they just cannot get a stop when they need it. They give up a ton of points. This game last time against USC was super high scoring. I expect it to be the same on Saturday. It should be a high scoring affair because I think this defense will just struggle to stop this USC offense who can put up a ton of points. It can beat you in a variety of different ways. There's a depth available for this Utah team, especially if Phillips doesn't play. The depth is just not there for this Utah team to stop USC on Saturday.
And despite having some good depth at linebacker, Lander Barton, Mohamed Diabate, the Florida transfer, Karen Reed, these guys are all respectable players. They've also not been too great themselves this year. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this Utah defense, because when USC played them the first time on their home turf in Salt Lake City, they were on fire. Looking at team comparisons for this game. What the hell am I? Oh, my God. I got to refresh. I could have just kept going, but okay. Looking at team comparisons, I think USC, it's a clean sweep on offense besides the offensive line. They've been great on the interior, but I think, as a complete 5-man unit, Utah has a bit of an edge there. Physicality-wise, though, I'm not really sure if Utah is that strong. Even though I'm going to give them the edge on the defensive line, it's not exactly there. I do think USC's defensive front is great. They still give up a lot of rushing yards, and penetration against the run is not exactly great. Tui Kolotu, he's been elite, but still, they're really getting beat up on the ground, even though that game against Notre Dame was hopefully a sign of things to come the rest of the way for Lincoln Riley's squad. Linebacker, I'm going to call it even, because I think both teams, have some good players, some good depth, but neither team has exactly been great in the middle of their defense. Secondary-wise, I'm going to give USC the edge. 19 interceptions. If I had to guess, that's probably first in college football. While Utah, they've struggled. They were not good against UCLA at all. That's a team that only has a handful of pass catchers. They're not full of depth. Of course, they got skinned by USC the first time. And this is a secondary that was not great against Oregon either. Hobbled Bo Nix, a one-dimensional offense for the most part, was just picking them apart. Almost 300 yards for him in that game, which was pretty shocking to see. I think these rosters are pretty close, I would say, but in terms of offense, USC far and away much more depth and production. Do you agree with most of these, or are you thinking something else elsewhere?
I think most of these I agree with. I would give the defensive line to USC. I just think they have too much talent on the defensive line. They produce too many sacks when that defensive line is moving at full speed to get the edge over Utah for me. I also think that the linebacker, you could probably give it to Utah for me. I think that the sum of the parts for Utah, yes, they've been disappointing, but the talent is certainly there. And if they're firing on all cylinders, that linebacking core is phenomenal. But outside of that, I think the offense makes a whole lot of sense. I like Utah's offensive line, great size there. And when you have 19 interceptions, like you said, you got to give the edge to the secondary for USC. They're just a fantastic secondary. Get a ton of picks every single game, probably leading the nation in picks. I like that number for sure. I'll take the DBs for USC.
And they've been pretty awful against tight ends. Michael Mayer, I don't know what his stats were, but he recorded a bunch of production against them here recently. So looking at the final thoughts and the prediction, biggest keys of the game, I think for USC, showcase that toughness against the run. Seems like it's improving. Will it stick? Will it not? Remains to be seen. I certainly think the capability is there, especially now they're a bit hobbled in their backfield. And then I think just keep an eye on the injury report for USC. That's also important because we named 3 guys in this podcast numerous times that either not playing or if they will, they're going to be banged up. So I think that's one key to watch there. For Utah, the defense has to perform better in all facets. They've really struggled against these better offenses this year. I think they got to make their possessions count. They're going to go against the high-flying USC offense. They might not be able to slow down. So they're going to have to grind it out, run the football. Cam Rising, obviously, not playing his best football. I think he needs to play much better as well. I'm a USC fan, so I will not make a prediction on this game. But, Nick, you're seeing it being completely different than the game in Salt Lake City. The Ute fans love to travel, so I think they'll have a bit of an edge here in terms of crowd. But you don't think it's going to be a factor?
There's so much momentum with this team and a lot of playoff hopes
riding on this team. I think the keys for me is if USC can find a pass rush early, get after Cam Rising, make him uncomfortable, force him into plays he's not ready to make. I think that's the best key to success for US on Friday. For me, for Utah, you got to value the possessions. Got to make sure you pick up good yards on first and second down. Certainly try to get Bernard involved early, 5-6 yards on first down. Make sure you get good yardage when you can, because if you don't and you find yourself behind the chain, you're going to be desperate making plays and give this USC defense opportunity to pick you off and force turnovers. You're going to find yourself in a deep hole. I'm taking USC 38-20 here. I think this team has gotten better every single day as the season goes on. I love the performance last week against Notre Dame. I nailed my prediction that last week. I think that was a good, kind of matchup for them, a good kind of opponent to get late in the season. I think this USC team has too much firepower on offense. They're going to put a ton of points on Saturday on 38s. Maybe not as many as you'd hope for them, but I think they'll put 38 on Saturday and find their way right into the playoffs.
And USC, like you said, that momentum seems to be high-flying right now after 2 impressive wins, and then the playoffs are right in front of them. That's going to be it for today's episode, guys. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.